hypothesis is that high resilience, so if you have a given level of risk for anxiety, high resilience will decrease your risk for developing psychiatric illness. So if you have high anxiety and high resilience, the high resilience will decrease your risk. If you have low anxiety and low resilience, you're good. If you have medium levels of anxiety and high resilience, essentially they will counteract each other and negate the risk. That's the hypothesis. We don't know if it's going to be correct, but based on the Ugandan study, high resilience clearly is protective in some ways. This is one of my favorite cartoons because it really shows that kind of internal attitude, internal resilience matters. What Charlie Brown is saying here is, this is my depressed stance. And Sally says, when you're depressed, it makes a lot of difference in how you stand. And Charlie Brown says, the worst thing you can do is straighten up and hold your head high because then you start to feel better. He says, if you're going to get any joy out of being depressed, you've got to stand like this. Basically, the point is attitude is important, and self-esteem really can be taught, or in this case, faked. Faked isn't quite the right word, but it can be kind of internalized. If it's not automatically present, you can internalize it by teaching it. So why are we studying Costa Rica? There's two reasons. One of the reasons is that Costa Rica has a very unique history in Latin America and in the rest of the world. The Central Valley of Costa Rica was founded by about 300 families from Andalusia, Spain, who came and intermarried with the indigenous population because of the stability of the country and because of the geographic restrictiveness of the Central Valley, the jungles and the surrounding mountains. The people in the Central Valley are all actually quite closely related to each other, and almost all of them are descended from those 300 initial founders who came in 1562. So you can think of the Central Valley population, at least those people who have been here for a number of generations, as being essentially one very large family. So from a genetic perspective, they're very similar to one another, and that actually helps genetic studies and biological studies. That's one of the reasons that we do genetic studies here. But from an epidemiologic perspective for the kinds of studies that we're interested in, it's also a very good place to do these studies because Costa Rica is comparatively economically and demographically stable. It's clearly economically more homogeneous than the United States. It has a very high education rate. In fact, the numbers of kids graduating from secondary school is higher in Costa Rica than in the United States. We have the ability to recruit from all kinds of schools and get a representative sample. Actually, because we have the collaboration of the Ministry of Education, we have access to all of the schools in the Central Valley. The principals have to agree to participate, but we have access to essentially all of the schools, which is unprecedented and certainly could not be done in the U.S. There are relatively low rates of violence, and there's an excellent healthcare system, which helps with the physical deprivation problem, but also if we find kids who need help, we have a good referral source. Again, not necessarily as possible in the United States. So here is the distribution of colegios. We're specifically focusing on schools or colegios in the Central Valley of Costa Rica. It's about 30% private schools, about 60% public schools, and about 5% subsidized schools. There are 303 schools in the Central Valley that have populations or student enrollment that's 100 kids or greater. You can see from the left panel the distribution of rural, low income, medium income, and high income. And you can also see that these are old statistics, but the relative proportions still hold true, that there is not a really great difference between people at low income and people at high income, meaning that there isn't a huge amount of socioeconomic or socio-demographic variability. There is variability, but not a huge amount, which makes it a lot easier to do a study like this. So the procedures. We have been identifying schools randomly from the list that we have from the Ministry of Education, and obtaining permission from the principals and the school board to enroll the students in the school, or to enroll the students, to ask the students if they're interested in enrolling in the study. We send flyers about the study, explaining the study home with the children. However, we know, all of those of you who have teenagers also know that those papers never make it out of the backpacks to the parents, and from the parents back to the students, back to us. They sit somewhere in between forever, or they fall into a black hole. So we also contact the parents, either through parent-teacher meetings or through direct contact or through the principal's emails to obtain their consent to participate in the study. We then visit the homes of all of the children who agreed to participate and have them complete the questionnaires confidentially. So the parents don't have access to the questionnaire information, so the kids can answer more honestly. So far, we have targeted 20 schools, initially in the Central Valley. We've approached 12 schools. It's actually quite impressive. The schools are quite interested in participating. I was a little surprised at how well we've done, but 7 of them have agreed to participate. 6 of them are currently in process, are participating. 1 initially participated and then became uncomfortable and withdrew from the study, but the other 6 are continuing to go on. 1 has declined to participate, and 4 are still deciding whether they want to participate or are in the process of getting permission from the school board. 3 of those will probably participate. The other one, I don't think, we don't know one way or the other. So there's good participation in the schools, and we'll go beyond these first 20 once we've sampled these kids. We are assessing the kids for resilience. Anna talked about the Individual Protective Factors Index. That's our measure of resilience. We also want a measure of genetic risk. And the measure of genetic risk that we're looking at is the state trait anxiety inventory. That's a measure of trait anxiety or essentially temperament with the focus of anxiety. And I'll show you what these instruments look like in the general population in a minute. We also are screening them with a measure of anxiety that's tied to psychopathology. So it looks at panic attacks, generalized symptoms, separation anxiety, social anxiety. 20% of the children, so 1,000 of the children, we will do a complete psychiatric interview to assess for, more formally, for mood disorders, anxiety disorders, eating disorders, substance abuse disorders, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, all of the disorders of childhood. So these are the distributions of the screening questionnaires. And what you'll see, let's see, which one is which? The IPI is the one on the upper right. The state is the one on the upper left, and the mask, I think, is the one on the lower left. It doesn't matter, they all have similar profiles. Did I say it backwards? Oh, okay, I switched it, sorry. But what you'll see is that there's a normal distribution in the population. Most of the kids fall right in the middle. There are a few kids who have very low scores and a few kids who have very high scores. But it's really distributed just like blood pressure, height, intelligence is distributed. So it's a nice normal distribution, which is exactly what we want. We don't want there to be big changes. We really want to see a complete spectrum of profiles in the kids. We also found that there are, as expected, relationships between resilience and anxiety symptoms. So the state, which is the measure of anxiety temperament, and the mask, which is the measure of essentially psychopathology, are correlated, about 50% correlated. The state and the resilience scale are actually about 60% correlated, but they're negatively correlated. So the higher your anxiety temperament, the lower your resilience. And the mask, which is the measure of psychopathology, and the resilience scale are also correlated, but at a much lower rate, at about 30%. So there's a relationship between all of these profiles, which is what we would expect. We've also found that these measures are heritable, which means that there's a genetic component to them. And the heritability is a measure of how genetic they are. So the state, which is our measure of the genetic risk of anxiety, is about 60% heritable. That's actually quite high. It suggests that as we suspected, anxiety temperament runs in families, is inherited, is genetic in nature. But we were actually surprised to find that the resilience is also quite heritable. It's about 30% heritable. So you inherit about 30% of your underlying resilience profile, let's say. The other 70% is due to environmental factors, familial factors, those kinds of things. And then your risk for psychopathology is about where we would expect it for the risk for anxiety disorders. It's about 25%. And that's based on looking at the similarities between the siblings in our sample. So what does all that mean? Well, as I said, anxiety symptoms and resilience are inversely related. So the higher your resilience, the lower your anxiety. That's what we predicted. That's great. The mask and the state measure different things. One measures psychopathology, one measures temperament. Both resilience and anxiety run